Stars just appearing and disappearing with a 45% uptick the day before and the day after a nuclear test from photographic plates in the pre-Sputnik era before there were satellites in space that might have accounted for this. Some think this might be evidence, proof that we were being watched by something from outer space. But is there a more mundane answer to this? And then there's the statements by Secretary of State of the United States, Marco Rubio, about things flying around our nuclear facilities. Wow. Are these are they aliens or are they just bugs on our windshield? Or we're going to dive all into this. So buckle up. See, what happened is the Hale telescope, the 200-inch reflector at the Palomar Observatory, was for a long time the most powerful telescope on Earth. It went into service in 1948. They started building the telescope, and I think 1934, back in the 1930s, is when they started building the observatory there. So we've got roughly 85 years of observations, mainly on glass photographic plates. That's how they used to do it. So the evidence that we have is from glass plate photography, just like they used to do back in the war between the states. But in fact, we today take this data with charge coupled devices on our telescopes, and we didn't start making that transition from glass plates to CCDs until the late 1970s, get more mainstream in the 80s, and we didn't make the transition fully until the year 2000. But the glass plates, that's the history, where they've started looking back at them and seeing rather strange things. So they started this sky-wide survey to survey all the stars that they could find with the Hale telescope at the Palomar Observatory. And this was called the National Geographic Society Palomar Observatory Sky Survey, or POSSI, P-O-S-S-I, like what the sheriff would send out for the bad guys. But like I said, they conducted this survey from 1949 to 1958. Of course, 1957, Sputnik was launched. So there is another organization that's taken upon themselves, once these anomalies, these transient stars were identified, stars that were there, they went poof, they were gone. They didn't show up on the next plate. Maybe like 50 minutes later, they were no longer there. And in one case, there's a group of 3 stars. Highly strange. So a group took it on themselves to look in this. It's called VASCO, the Vanishing and Appearing Sources during a century of observations. They call that VASCO, and they started their project in 2017, going back through all these plates and trying to determine just what was going on. Their primary interest was the pre-Sputnik era, as I mentioned, because they wanted to make sure they didn't have interference in these observations. So the oddball thing is that uptick a day before and a day after. The day before might be a little harder to explain where we're going, but so as it turns out, it may be quite explainable by mundane things. But let's just go in and look at some of the articles on this stuff. We'll look at, yeah, hang on. We're going to share the screen here and look at this. Like right here. Here are 3 stars. Here they are. 50 minutes later, they're gone. Now it says pixels. They've converted this. They digitized it, but it was originally not pixelated. It was on glass plates. And glass plates, you know, photographic techniques actually have more resolution typically than pixels. It takes a lot of pixels to approximate what a glass plate can do. But, you know, charged coupled devices tend to be more sensitive these days with the newer technology. That's why they switch to them, especially when you cool them down real cold, like cryogenic especially. But in any event, this photograph was taken 19 July 1952 by the Hale telescope at the Palomar Observatory, that 200-inch telescope, which, as I said, was the world's most powerful. And these were magnitude 15 stars. They're pretty bright. three bright stars. There they were, and then they're gone. So we're going to explore some of the mundane reasons why this might not be what it looked like at first. But then we're going to come back to these three because there's something else about them that's kind of interesting in the grand scheme of some of the things we've been talking about recently, like my dark fortress concept, which is distinct from dark forest, okay? For those that don't know. But anyway, here was a picture that this group, this Vasco group, came up with in the vanishing and appearing sources during a century of observations. That's what they call themselves. They started this up in 2017. And then that one example was the right shoulder star of Betelgeuse, which is a red Betelgeuse, excuse me, is the star, which is a red giant. I think it may be going supernova, may have already gone supernova, but it's going to take a while for the light to reach us. I think it's 400 light years away. I have to double check that. But so Betelgeuse is a large star, but it diminished brightness 50%. And that was a real mystery for a while, but it's been conjectured because it blew off a bunch of dust, and that dust occulted the star some and made it harder to see. That's one theory for why it got so dim, and people were wondering, was it going to vanish? No, it actually just came back. We see Betelgeuse quite readily now, but for a while, if you looked up at Betelgeuse, it was mysteriously dim. So there's several different things that could play into this. Here they're saying Dyson spheres could cause stars to vanish. There's been some stars that have showed up just very recently that may be candidates for Dyson spheres or partial Dyson spheres, but there's nothing conclusive on that. Now, if a star did, or actual star did vanish without any explanation, then we might have proof of a Kardashev Type 2 civilization. Kardashev Type 2 is a civilization that can harness the power of their star. So, and a Type 3 could harness this galaxy. So we're going to fly all in this. So why do these stars vanishing? Well, as I said, there may be some really good explanations. Now, here's one that actually turned into a black hole. Here it is. There it's not. That's an actual star. This is not a misprint due to errors with the photographic plates like we're going to go into. This one actually turned into a black hole. And this was a giant star, N6946-BH1. Yeah, that's how stars, they got, numeric address type names quite often. So, then here's the findings of this study here that said, they were looking at the data, and they didn't go to 1958 because they wanted to look at prior to the Sputnik satellites. So they said that results revealed a significant associations between nuclear testing and observed transients, with transients 45% more likely a day before and a day after. I mean, this star would just show up and it would just disappear. Like, are they watching us? That's what they were a little worried about. And so they linked this to, as part of the first artificial satellite. They tested hypotheses about it, and data set that, like I said, they went from November 19th, 1949 to 28 April 1957 with this study. And that's what they found. Now, see, Palomar is not that far from the testing grounds in Nevada. So there might be, so maybe somebody would choose that to be a good place to watch from, just way up in space above the area. Or maybe because of the proximity to the test sites, there's another explanation. So we'll get all in that. So here they are, the Vasco, looking at pre-Sputnik satellites. And yeah, and that's a plate of the satellites. That's what they were interested in. But, what we find is that the observations show that these plates, a couple of things are going. They used an emulsion to develop the image on the glass plate. It's a chemical emulsion, and they used different colors or emulsions that would bring out different wavelengths of light. One explanation could be that in one case they're trying to pull out the infrared, in one case they're trying to pull out the bluer stars. So some will be red and some will be blue. That's one explanation for uh, why they might be looking at different wavelengths. That may explain away some of these transient stars, at least the ones that disappeared on those plates. But then they should have showed up in subsequent plates, correct? So there, you got to go to another explanation, and the most likely explanation is that and this talks about blemishes in the actual plate, but more likely the emulsion had bubbles in it. The emulsion itself. And see, quite often what you would see is a white spot. And what they discovered was that these transient objects, when they looked at them in a microscope, imagine this, you're looking at a picture taken from a telescope with a microscope to resolve it. Is that funny? But anyway, use a microscope to discern telescopic information. But what they discovered, because this was hard to see with the naked eye, was that these transients were rounder. And see, when light from a star goes through space, the star is round, but there's atmospheric distortion. And gives you that twinkle effect. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. So there you are. But what they found was these were more concentrated and circular than typical stellar images of the same estimated brightness. So what they figured out was that this was actually bubbles in the emulsion. That's pretty mundane. But we'll go back to those other three in a little bit. Those get more curious for another reason. We'll go back to it. So, but in more recent times, so that could kind of explain all that away. Oh yeah, there's one other thing. One other thing to explain about the uptick rate. See, the bubbles don't explain why you would get an uptick a day before or a day after a nuclear test. Maybe not. But photographic film actually was having issues. Kodak discovered they were getting dark spots on their film around, just right after a nuclear test. And what they found, they had this Dr. Julian Webb there. He from Kodak. He was doing research on this film, and because the customers were starting to complain, they were wanting the money back. And he found there was cerium 141 radioactive isotopes in their film. And that was creating spots on it. And it was so bad that Kodak went to the government. They want to know what the heck was going on. How did they get to seize them? Kodak discovered the classified nuclear tests before they were ever announced publicly. And Kodak was, the government did not want Kodak to blow the lid on them. Their secrecy. Kodak found out. So the government paid off the Kodak because Kodak was about to sue them and could blow the lid on it, and then the government couldn't afford that with these top secret nuclear tests. At the time they were secret. So we're talking in the before we dropped the bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So could that account for what Palomar was seeing? Possibly, except for maybe the day before. I mean, the radiation don't show up before the event occurred. So they were finding these transients, that 45% uptick the day before and the day after. Now that's curious. It could be that the emulsion was contaminated or maybe particles got on the plates before they were developed, and maybe they didn't develop them until a day or two after. I don't know. That's a possibility. That is a possibility. So the uptick before may be harder to explain unless there was some delay in processing, which may be the case. May have been the case. Somebody can go back that's involved in Palomar, maybe answer that question. But that's an interesting prospect. That uptick is interesting. It may be harder to explain. It would be harder to explain with just normal bubbles. But why would it be bubbles? Might be something else. But anyway, so Maybe it's getting on the telescope. So where were these particles coming from? How did they contaminate the process at Palomar? Was the winds traveling from east to west? And that's another curious thing. So you would think it would have to do with the travel of wind, because fallout follows wind patterns. And winds usually blow in the northern hemisphere from the west to the east, except for in the summertime, there's a turnaround and they go the other way sometimes. So at least at the jet stream level. So there you are. Highly curious, is it not, that you got this transient, which might be explainable. And I use the word might. So there's another curiosity about those three ones. We'll come back to them. But turns out that Marco Rubio, he's been making some statements. And supposedly he's disclosed that UFOs are hovering over restricted nuclear facilities. And there's this documentary that's coming out, I guess next month, about disclosure. This documentary was made in secret by the producers because they were afraid they were going to get shut down by the powers that be. So they kept it under the radar that they were producing this documentary. They got some very high level interviews. You got to bear in mind the Secretary of State is one of the most powerful people in the United States government. In the administration, the presidential administration aside, he's probably the top position aside from the vice president. And at one time, that was considered even higher. And quite often, and further back in history, the Secretary of State was more likely to become the next president than the vice president. So, unless the president kicked the bucket. Of course, you can see these interesting little tic-tac videos, which we know the military filmed, which defy some level of explanation. So we don't know what those are yet. We've talked about them several times on this channel. Go back and look at my older videos on it to see my discussion. So we're going to play a couple of clips of Marco Rubio in the trailer for this upcoming production that's coming out, this upcoming film. So on disclosure. So look at this. We're just going to play him. He's the Secretary of State.
Something operating in the airspace over restricted nuclear facilities, and it's not ours.
Something operating in the airspace over nuclear facilities, and it's not ours. Let's hear that again. He said there is. It's a very declarative statement.
Something operating in the airspace over restricted nuclear facilities, and it's not ours.
What? Now, in the past, he's made a lot of statements about claims other people have made in regards to this. These people claim this. I've seen a ton of videos on his earlier pontifications on the subject. And like I said, he made a lot of claims, but it's always reference to claims other people makes. Now, this may have been taken out of context. He might have said that kind of stuff up front in this case, but it really don't sound like the way he said it there. But what he said next, which is further into this trailer, I'm not going to play the whole trailer because I don't want to get hit with a claim. So hopefully, trailers are usually for everybody to see. So you can see this trailer on X and many other places, probably YouTube. So let's check this out.
Even presidents have been operating on a need-to-know basis.
Even presidents have been operating on a need-to-know basis. He just said it right there. This is what a lot of people have been saying for decades. Even presidents are operating on a need-to-know basis.
But that begins to ramp out of control.
He said that begins to get out of control. And, I think I've seen him say that, the presidents don't get to see this stuff. When the government, the state that's so deep gets to have data and know things that the president can't access, that's a bit of an issue. But that's what's been alleged for a long time. Even going back to the Eisenhower era. Interesting. Is that not interesting? And then we got Tim Burchett here. He believes that they have underwater bases, and he's come out and said that these are things that are coming out of underwater bases. He just flat out said it. I just think traveling light. This is a quote from him. I just think traveling light years. I think it happens. Uh, I think it's possible in the vastness of God's great universe. I mean, light years. The light from those stars we see at night left there before the time of Christ. In some cases, a lot of them are farther away than that. Burchett said that this on a former Matt Gaetz show. Matt Gaetz was a congressman too. Now he's got a One American News show. So Matt Gaetz is a former congressman. Tim Burchett is a current congressman. Matt Gaetz was from, well, he's from Florida. At least that's where he represented from. And Tim Burchett is in the district in Tennessee that Knoxville's in. So they got a great university up there in Knoxville, if you hadn't heard of it. But anyway, University of Tennessee. So this is more on Burchett here. Basically saying the same thing. So what is happening here? And then there's a sailor whose dad worked in Area 51. He was a sailor saying he saw these things coming up out of the ocean. 4 of them had them on, instruments. Now, he saw a couple. He ran in and looked at the instruments, and there was actually 4. But they didn't see them all with their eyes, but they caught them on the instruments in the ship. So Tic Tac type devices coming out of the ocean. It's been, said that there was some activity like this off Puerto Rico and some off of, out in the Bermuda Triangle area, believe it or not, but Bermuda basically. But basically, most of them have been seen off Southern California, and that's where this guy was at the time on this ship. And this is Chief Operations Specialist Alexandro Wiggins. He was a Navy veteran for 23 years. So, he was on the USS Jackson when this took place in 15th February of 2023. So, that's kind of interesting. He's not a nobody. 23 years of experience. He kind of knew what he was working with there. There he is right there. So, interesting claim. But let's go back to these 3 points. Now, one thing strikes me about these, if these were bubbles or radiation events, look how, again, it is like perfect spheres, but look at this overlap right here. Almost overlap without disturbing the geometry of each other. If it was a bubble, you'd think we would have combined. So maybe it was a radiological event, but this particular event, to my knowledge, was not associated with a nuclear test. Now, somebody can go back and double check that. So is this not interesting? 2 bubbles right here, or 2 things that are not, the symmetry is circular for both of them, even though they're overlapping. Kind of strange case to make for a bubble. Even radiation, you would think would kind of smear out a little bit. If there were something making a radiation spot, and they're that close, you'd think something else would happen there. Maybe. I don't know in that case. But the interesting thing is that it says here that if they were 10 arc seconds from each other, if they were 3 individual objects, then something must have triggered their brightening. How do you get 3 objects brighten at once and then wink out? Given the time span of 50 minutes, the time one plate was taken to the next, causality and the speed of light would require they be no more than 6 astronomical units apart. Astronomical unit is the distance between Earth and the Sun. 93 million miles, and 6 astronomical units would be within like our inner solar system. So that's not far out, really. This means they could have, that's like just past Jupiter. So, it says this means they would have to be no more than 2 light years away, given the distance. These would have, so they'd be much closer than a star. Couldn't be a star. They could have been Oort cloud objects. Look at this. They could have been Oort cloud objects where some event caused them to brighten around the same time. Later observations couldn't find them because they had since drifted along their orbits, being Oort cloud objects. They wouldn't be traveling with the stars. They'd be in orbit around the sun. And maybe whatever caused them to brighten wasn't there to brighten them anymore. What in the world could that be? So let's stop the chat about that just a minute. Oort cloud objects. I just did a video on Oort cloud objects, and it was the premise of my new dark fortress concept answer to the Fermi paradox, in which I postulate that not, the Fermi paradox says that, it's a paradox because there's two precepts that can't both be true at the same time. One, they should already be here, and two, we don't see them. At least we think we don't. So if you got these two things in coexistence, it's a paradox because they really can't coexist. So there has to be some answer, and a lot of people have been scratching their heads since Enrico Fermi came up with this at a party back in 1950. So, and there's been many theories. One of them's the Great Filter, which says the society just can't survive to get to the level of being able to travel the stars. There's some other theories, and we'll go in. And there's been some really lame ones come out lately. I think I'm out to do a video cracking on the lamer ones. But guys, the dark forest theory says that they're afraid because if they chatter and are seen, there may be more technologically advanced civilizations that would come and wreak havoc upon them, wipe them out, conquer them, whatever. That's the dark forest concept. So they're on their little planets and suddenly they zip their lips. They don't send out the radio stuff. They don't send out probes in the universe telling people how to get there, like our Voyager 1 probe. They don't send signals out announcing who we are, when we are, like we did with our Arecibo telescope some years ago before it fell apart. Stephen Hawking said, "Stop it. That's not smart," because he was already there with that idea of the dark forest concept. But I take it one step further. I'm saying that, maybe they don't even want to be on their planets anymore because that's where everybody's going to be looking to see evidence of civilizations. And you can do this with sufficiently powered telescopes from a long distance away. So the smart thing to do might be to move out to the Oort clouds around the stars. And from the Oort clouds, you've got vast resources. You could actually replicate your civilization many times over. I was basically following the premise of building vernal spheres, which would be like a mile, a little better than a mile, 1.12 miles in diameter, rotate them at 1 RPM, and you get 1 Earth gravity. And you could have a world turned inside out with a biosphere on the inside. Trees, parks, rivers. You can make them bigger. So that's the idea of the vernal sphere. O'Neillian space colony, his top 3 colony, was going to be 4 miles in diameter, 20 miles long. He's going to pair them together to counterspin, so that you could move it around without having to deal with the angular momentum of the gyroscopic effect. So you keep it pointed at the sun. In that case, is what he was trying to do. But vernal sphere doesn't. You don't have to do that vernal sphere, especially if you have internal heat and lights from like a nuclear reactor. So you could actually replicate from our Oort cloud and our Kuiper belt 35,700 times approximately the surface area of the Earth. You could have a population 2.2 billion times bigger than the population we have now. We're talking something like 19 quintillion people or more. Because I think you'd actually make it far more productive than that. It's based on 1 person per kilometer square. Or it could be 1 space alien. So there's actually vast riches and resources in space, our asteroid belt, and on out into the Kuiper belt and Oort cloud. So there's actually reasons to go there other than just fear of being caught and seen. But so maybe a civilization, once they're spreading out in the Oort clouds from each star, they're just kind of, they wind up being pretty adjacent because your Oort cloud will go out a couple of light years from the main star, almost halfway to the nearest star. So it might be easy for a civilization, once they're out at the edges of the Oort cloud, just to hop from star to star to star to star. So maybe, just maybe, they're already out there in our Oort cloud. And maybe there was an explosion, like a nuclear detonation or something, and just lit up three of them, or some big signal or some light. Something may have happened. Maybe they had a little war up there. I'm saying maybe. That's all conjecture. I showed you some data, and I totally debunked, for the most part, this case. But just maybe it wasn't radiation. Just maybe it wasn't bubbles, because having those overlapping bubbles is very curious. Bubbles like to join. Or if they do, yeah, sometimes you get a bubble on a bubble, but they're usually like just half a bubble, like a dome. That wasn't half a bubble. It was like, a little bit of an overlap. I mean, you ever blow bubbles on bubbles or make bubbles in a tub? They don't form looking like that bubble on that plate, or those three, especially those two that were overlapping. So what was it? By the data, they said it looks like it would have to come from the Oort cloud. Well, comets shouldn't be just lighting up, not on their own. And what was that trans-Neptunian object I talked about earlier that caused that just coincidentally, totally coincidentally, our probe on the way to take pictures of Pluto went by to try to image it, and it shut down. And then woke back up after it was too far away to take good images again. Interesting. Could be totally coincidental. Could be. But it makes one stop for a minute and go, Because according to the Fermi paradox, they should be here. And yet we don't see them. Well, this could be why you don't see them. They could be all hiding out in comets, asteroids. And of course, if they wanted to come see us, if they were suspecting us and wanted to investigate us, they would use a comet or asteroid. Hello, 3i Atlas. Yeah, it's probably just a rock. Wow. So if you want to see my video, so I highly encourage you to see the Dark Fortress video if you hadn't watched it. And hey, it's kind of, I did it with a spooky ambience because it was a spooky subject. And so I had a little fun with it. But, if you want to see that video, check up here. It should be up here in the banner. So I'm going to say thank y'all for watching. Subscribe, bang the bell, click all, and comment on this in the comments below. Tell me what you think about these things. Is it all just bugs on the windshield? As in radioactive particles and bubbles in the emulsion? Could be. Could be all there is to it. And what's Rubio talking about? Does Rubio really know something? Or is he just taking the words of others? Do they know something? Is it credible? What is going on? We do know they got Tic Tac videos. What are those things? Lots of mysteries, my friends. Lots of mysteries. And you'll see, we'll try to delve into them more here in the future. Hopefully I do have one other topic similar to this to kind of bang on a little bit. I'm going to talk about Mount Hayes coming up. Because I used to live at Fort Greeley. I used to look at it every day. There's a lot being said about that. Anyway, again, I want to thank everybody for watching.